Well, good evening and welcome, and also Yom Tov and Gut Yom Tif for all those Yiddish speakers. The warmest possible welcome to everybody joining us tonight, whether you're celebrating Hanukkah or whether you've come along to find out about this important Jewish festival. My name is Sue Shave, and I am currently have the privilege of being the director of Bucks County Museum. And I'm delighted to welcome you tonight to our very first Hanukkah online webinar. Museums collect objects and stories, and they should be reflecting the communities around them. And we're very aware at Bucks County Museum that for a while we haven't really been reflecting many, if any, of our communities. So we've been doing a lot of work recently and talking to many of those communities to find out what they want from us now, and particularly in these very difficult times. So we were absolutely delighted when Rabbi James responded so positively and wanted to collaborate with us on this session tonight. So with me today, we've also got two of our museum staff. So we've got Mel, who's our art curator, and we've got Simon, who is our community outreach officer. And when we have the sessions tonight, it is possible for you to join in. We've got a Q&A function, which should be probably at the bottom of your screen. And if you press on that, you can add comments or questions as we go along. We won't be actually answering those questions until the end of the session, but we'd be delighted to effectively respond at that point. We've got a couple of questions of our own at the end. So without more ado, I'm going to hand over to Rabbi Neil James to talk to us all about Hanukkah.
Thanks, Sue. And it's really wonderful that we're able to join with you. It's such an important part for SBJC to be part of the local community of Buckinghamshire, and to be invited is very important for us. So thank you so much for the invitation. Just as having the artifacts and the museum experience, so too, it's all part of life in the area as well. So I'm going to share with you a little bit about Hanukkah and the significance of it and the background, the history and how we celebrate as Jews. And hopefully that will then lead seamlessly into Mel's presentation about some of the ceramics later on. I haven't got a particularly good link, except that when we talk about oil and vessels for holding oil, there was a recent discovery in Israel, actually, of an archaeological hoard of oil lamps that were all obviously ceramic. And so there's our connection, the ceramics of 2000 years ago and the ceramics of the 20th century. But let me take you into the history of Hanukkah. So the events of Hanukkah take place in the 2nd century BCE. In the Jewish community, we talk about BCE and CE, before the Common Era and the Common Era, which is really a reflection of our theology. We don't believe in before Christ and in the year of our Lord. It's not the same for us. So we talk about BCE and CE. Same period, so 2nd century before the Common Era. And the events are described in 2 books that actually we only have in Greek today. They form part of what is known as the Apocrypha. And the Apocrypha are books that don't make it into the Hebrew Bible, what you may know as the Old Testament, or the New Testament. They sit in between, although if you get a Catholic Bible, you will find that they do have a position within the canon. But in the Jewish Hebrew Bible, they're not inside the books. They are apocryphal. They are extra hidden books that aren't part of the main canon. And the 2 books that the story of Hanukkah is described in are the 1st book of Maccabees and the 2nd book of Maccabees. They're slightly different. The 1st book of Maccabees probably was written in Hebrew. 2nd book of Maccabees probably in Greek for the Alexandrian Jewish community, who are quite Hellenized and Greek speakers. And we're in the world in the 2nd century BCE of the 2 empires that have formed out of Alexander the Great's Greek Empire. We have the Ptolemaic Empire, which is really across Egypt, and the Seleucid Empire. And you can see on the map, actually, that Israel is this tiny little bit that joins Africa to the rest of the Middle East. And that's why it's significant, the land of Israel, because it's a land bridge between the continents. And so for the Seleucids and the Ptolemaic empires, it's very important who has control of it for trade and for the movement of your armies and so on and so forth. Now, Antiochus IV Epiphanes controlled the land of Judea. He was the king of the Seleucid Empire. And for various reasons, which are quite complicated, probably to do with both an internal struggle amongst the Jewish community living in Judea at the time, both about how Hellenized they wanted to become, and probably also because of the struggles, the power struggles of empires that are obviously so intriguing anyway. There were a series of decrees that come into place against the Jewish community in Judea, in what was part of the land of Israel. And the decrees were strongly anti-Jewish. Antiochus Epiphanes had clearly had enough of the Jews under his control, and so he forced them to worship Zeus in their temple, which of course is against Jewish law. And he also sacrificed pigs in the temple, which are of course not kosher, and banned the act of circumcision. And in Hellenism, the figure of the, particularly the male body, the perfection of the male body was very significant. The gymnasium was where you would go and you would exercise naked. That's what gymnos is. And so the physical form was very important. Circumcision was seen as very anti-Hellenistic. But for Jews, of course, it's the mark of the covenant. And so in response to this anti-Jewish laws, the high priest, we hear a high priest, not the high priest, called Mattathias, and his 5 sons, one of whom was called Judah, rebel against the persecution. And Judah, you'll know, Judah Maccabee, if you know the Handel oratorio, Judas Maccabeus, the conquering hero, they rise up and eventually beat the Seleucid Empire in a miraculous victory. That's our first miracle. And they take back control of Jerusalem and rededicate the temple that had been desecrated on the 25th of the month of Kislev, which is the month we're in now, the Hebrew month, in the year 165 BCE. Some debate over the year, but let's leave it at 165 BCE. And these events are recorded in the book of Maccabees, where we hear that the 8-day celebration of Hanukkah, of dedication, which is what Hanukkah means, is modeled on the Jewish festival of Sukkot, of tabernacles, or also on the dedication of the temple that Solomon dedicated much, much earlier. And so that's the potted history in the 2nd century. And now we have to move forwards on our slide and in our story to the Talmud. Now, the Talmud, you can see on your pages that this is an image of the Talmud. The Talmud is created, composed, evolves in Babylon in the Sasanian Empire. So we're now talking the 3rd to the 5th or 6th century of the Common Era. And the Jews, the Jewish community living in Babylon, are recording the discussions and debates over how to be Jewish and what it means to be Jewish. And we read, probably around the 4th century, an account of what the miracle was. The Talmud asks, "My Hanukkah," it's an Aramaic word, what is Hanukkah? And the answer they give is not the same answer as we find in the book of Maccabees. The answer they give is the answer that we all know is the basis of our story. So we've had the miracle of the rededication and the beating back the Seleucid Empire, but now we read the Greeks entered the sanctuary, they defiled all the oils that were in the sanctuary, and when the Hasmoneans, who were the dynasty that was the Maccabean dynasty, overcame them and emerged victorious over them, they searched and found only one cruse of oil, a little pottery vessel of oil that was placed with the seal of the high priest on it. That was the only one that was kosher. And there was sufficient oil there to light the candelabrum, the menorah that was in the temple, for only one day. And a miracle occurred. They lit the candelabrum, the menorah from it, and it lasted for 8 days. The oil that was supposed to only last for one day lasted for 8. And so the next year they instituted those days and made them holidays. And so that's the Talmud's account of the history of Hanukkah. So we move on. We now have these 2 stories, these 2 miracles that occurred. And how is this significant for Jews today before we come back to how we celebrate it? So this story that occurs more than 2,000 years ago becomes important for us as Jews because in the first place, it's the miracle of being able to practice one's religion, to be Jewish specifically, not just any religion, but our religion, free of persecution. And that story of what it means to escape and be free from persecution is very important to us. The second, of course, is the miracle of the oil. We move from the military victory that happened by the Maccabees to the miracle of the oil, that God wrought a miracle for us God's divine providence and protection, if you like. And so the sense of freedom of Judaism, being able to be Jewish, and also the miracle of the oil. And then as Jews today, we also are aware how much of the anti-Semitism has been in the news, that this is also something that we're reminded of at Hanukkah, that we're able to celebrate our festivals freely. And I chose this slide, which is from this year, of the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, standing in front of a Hanukkah, even in an empty London in the pandemic, to marking Hanukkah. It was lit by the Jewish community and supported by the Jewish Leadership Council, who arranged for it to be erected in Trafalgar Square. And the significance is not lost on us as a society in Britain, that a mayor of London, who also is a Muslim, is supporting the Jewish community in marking our festivals. And so Hanukkah becomes a symbol for us of our freedom of religion, but also of the fear that we have of anti-Semitism, and yet the freedom that we enjoy in Britain. And the Hanukkah becomes then a symbol of light and of hope for everybody. We all need light at this time, especially in the pandemic, and especially as the days are still getting shorter. The symbol of light and of hope and of freedom becomes so important. And that's why it's such a wonderful thing, that it's almost a miracle that we have in Trafalgar Square, the Hanukkah. So the Hanukkah, on our next slide, what is the difference between a Hanukkah and a menorah? The menorah you can see on the left of the screen that was in the temple. This is a reconstruction of the menorah based partially on the Arch of Titus, which is in the little box, was a 7-branch candelabrum that's described both in the Torah, in the 5 books of Moses, and then later on in the books of Ezekiel and Zechariah, this 7-branch candelabrum. Now, that was what they lit the Maccabees to rededicate the temple. The Chanukiah is not 7 branches. It has 8 branches, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and one in the middle, the 9th. And the 9th branch is really a shamash, is a servant candle. It's to help light the other candles. I'll explain about that later. But so the menorah is a general word in Hebrew for candelabrum. Chanukiah is a word that's coined later on to describe the 8-branch candelabrum with the 9th, with the shamash. Last couple of things I want to tell you about in terms of Hanukkah are about how we celebrate Hanukkah itself. So on the next slide, you will see this is the Chanukiah. Now the Chanukiah is lit. This Chanukiah you can see on the slide is for the first day of Hanukkah. There's one candle lit with the one in the middle that's the shamash, the servant candle. And the first candle is lit on the first night of Hanukkah. Our days begin in the evening. On the second night, we light 2 candles. On the third night, we light 3, 4, 5, and tonight is the 6th night of Hanukkah. We light 6 candles tonight using the shamash. And actually, that it's the 6th night means it's also the beginning of the new month of Tevet, which also tells us we're getting close to the solstice and to the days actually stopping to get short and the nights getting long, and we'll start turning the corner on the year. And so light also becomes significant for that moment, for that reason too. How else do we celebrate Hanukkah? Well, on the next slide, you'll see, and I've brought my own little dreidel too. We eat oily foods. Here's my donut ready for later. If I can, that's dinner, I think. It's my favorite part of the festival. We play with a 4-sided spinning top that has letters on it, that is really probably a German gambling game, but we spin it and play with chocolate coins at home. And the letters on the outside tell us in Hebrew a great miracle happened there. And we give gifts, although gifts were not always the traditional celebration of Hanukkah. They were probably heavily influenced by another festival that happens to be around at this time of year, with the giving of gifts as so important. Probably in the influence of Christmas, gifts became fairly significant. And we sing songs as a family when we light the Chanukiah that remember and commemorate the miracle of the victory over the Syro-Greeks, the Seleucid Empire, persecuting the Jewish community, and also that remember the miracle of the oil that lasted for 8 nights when it should only have lasted for 1. We're told that perhaps the miracle of the oil wasn't just that it lasted for 8, it was the faith that the Hasmoneans, the Maccabees, had in lighting the candle in the first place. So that's how we celebrate Hanukkah. and the oil becomes significant for the for our festival, and was kept in little containers of pottery, and maybe that's our link in to the next part of the presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Neil. That was amazing. Thank you. So to move on, we've looked into our stores, looked into our fantastic 130,000 collections that we have at the museum. And we found a number of objects that really relate to Jewish heritage that we would love to share with you. So I'm going to introduce Mel, who's our art curator, and she's going to tell you a bit about some of our studio pottery.
Good evening, everyone. Well, I'm afraid that there was very little in our museum collection that we could definitely connect to the Jewish faith. But Sue asked me to think about it, and I did, and I thought, well, we've got a number of Jewish potters who came over here in the middle of the 20th century, and they were extremely important for the story of British studio ceramics, but I've never actually ever focused on this particular group of potters looking at their Jewish heritage. And so I thought, what a wonderful opportunity to explore this story with you today. Firstly, the term studio ceramics, in case you're not familiar with it, refers to individual ceramic pieces that are made by one potter, and they're made by hand from the initial design right through to the final firing. And they're regarded as art items because they're quite unique, as opposed to the mass-produced factory items that you might see in your tea service or dinner service. Now, at the time that a lot of these Jewish émigré potters came to England, the leading potter in England was a man called Bernard Leach, who had a pottery down in St. Ives in Cornwall. And he was very important for pioneering the rise of the artist potter. But his background was very much in Japanese, Korean, Chinese ceramics. And so that was the influence that he brought to studio ceramics. And the arrival of the Jewish potters breathed new life into British ceramics. These potters, they brought with them modernist ideas from Central Europe, and they created new and original work that was sleek, sophisticated, and cosmopolitan. And I'd like to look at 5 very different potters who all had an impact on British studio ceramics. So next slide, please, Simon. Right, the first potter I'm going to talk about is perhaps one of the least well known. She was called Marguerite Marx. She was born in Cologne, and she was a student at the Weimar Bauhaus, which is famous for its modernist design ideals. In 1923, she founded the Hale Pottery at Marwitz with her husband. And this was a highly successful company that employed 120 people and exported all over the world, including to places like Heels and Liberties in London. However, in the mid-1930s, life became extremely difficult for Jews in Germany. Her work was designated as degenerate, and she was forced to sell the company. She went traveling for a bit, and then in 1936, she emigrated to England. And she began to work as a ceramics designer up in the Stoke potteries. But she found that her continental modernist ideas were not widely accepted at the time. So she set up her own pottery, decorating bought-in biscuitware pieces, and she also had a very successful career as a painter. And she had a number of solo exhibitions in such esteemed places as the Ben-Uri Gallery in London. She didn't actually take up studio pottery, as in making individual pieces herself from start to finish, until the 1960s, by which time, you know, she was already about 60 years of age. And the two pieces that are on the screen date from this period. But she enjoyed working in this field, and she gained recognition in the field. And this was shown by the fact that she featured in the 1992 Crafts Council exhibition, Influential Europeans. And she had the honor of sharing her case with our next potter, Dame Lucy Ree. Dame Lucy Ree is one of the best known potters of this period. She was, her maiden name was Gompers, and she was born and brought up in Vienna. She was forced to flee Vienna in 1938 when Germany signed the Anschluss Agreement with Austria, and it was no longer a safe place for her to be. She studied at the Vienna School of Arts and Crafts that was associated with the avant-garde Wiener Werkstätte, and she was a protege of designer Joseph Hoffmann. The primary aim of the Wiener Werkstätte was to bring good design and craft into all areas of life. And Lucy Ree really, she took this on board, and her pots show this sort of elegance and modernity and ease of design. I'm sure that you agree that you could look at these pots and you could have them in your house today, and you know, you wouldn't know that they were 60 years old. She had a very successful career in Vienna, but when she came to London in 1938, she was at first unrecognized. During the war years, she made ceramic buttons for the fashion and clothing industries, but afterwards she returned to making more innovative pots. Could I have the next slide, please, Simon? These are some examples of the very elegant and cosmopolitan ware that she was producing, where you have the elegant footed bowls and the flared lip vases, which became icons of modern design. She was also a master of the sgraffito decoration technique, whereby you used a steel needle and a very steady hand to incise through the slip and the clay. Now, her pots belong to a distinctly contemporary world and retain both striking beauty and functionality for a modern lifestyle. She always aimed for beauty rather than making an artistic statement. During her life, she taught many students, and she was very inspirational to another generation of potters. Could I have the next slide, please, Simon? Now, one of her proteges was Hans Koper. He was born into a German Jewish family. Very sadly, his father committed suicide in 1936. And his two sons, Hans and his brother, left Germany for England in 1939 in the hope that this would protect their German non Jewish. She was at her doorstep one day, and she saw something in him, and she gave him a job, and he learnt ceramics really, really quickly and showed a really strong talent for it. They developed an enduring friendship, and he is credited with restoring her confidence in her work and encouraging her to pursue her modernist ideas. Koper himself became a leading figure in the British studio pottery movement. And you can see from the screen the kind of pots that he was producing, which consist of elements that are thrown and then shaped and assembled together in a more sort of sculptural way. And he mainly worked in these sort of monochrome shades. And he also undertook a number of very important public commissions, such as the monumental candlesticks by the altar in Coventry Cathedral. And his work continues to inspire and influence potters today. Next potter, please, Simon. Right, now moving on to Ruth Duckworth, who is a very different type of potter from the ones we've seen before. She was originally a sculptor, and again, she was brought up in Germany, but she was refused admittance to attend art school in Germany, and she deeply resented this. And she was, even as a young girl, she was a strong character, and there are reports of her defacing a Nazi monument in her hometown. She came to Britain in 1936 as a refugee with her older sister, and she enrolled at Liverpool Art School. And when the principal asked her what she wanted to do at the art school, she said, "I want to draw like Dürer, paint like Rembrandt, and sculpt like Michelangelo." So she was a girl of extreme ambition. And now she was initially determined to work as a sculptor, but she then became fascinated with using clay and ceramics. And in the 1950s, she was encouraged by Lucy Ree to study ceramics, and she thrived in the enlightened and experimental atmosphere of ceramics. In her studio in Kew in London, she produced functional ware with clean, minimal lines and individual vessels, often abstracted from nature, such as her coiled pots and totemic vases. Could we have the next slide, please, Simon? You'll see from the slide here on the one on the right, the coiled stoneware pot. Apparently she got the inspiration for decorating this pot in a sgraffito technique from cutting a red cabbage in half. And I'm sorry the screen doesn't do the pot justice, but if we ever get to the position where you can come and see the pot in our museum or stores, you will see that it really is quite a remarkable pot. Now, Ruth Duckworth left England for the United States in the 1960s, but she returned regularly. She always approached clay as a sculptural medium, and she changed the way people thought about ceramics. She worked on many scales, from small refined porcelain pieces, such as the tiny piece that I have on the left of the screen, which is only about 11 centimeters high, to large installations that covered entire walls. And she always had a deep understanding of form, proportion, and space. Next slide, please, Simon. Dan Arbeit is the last potter that I shall be talking about tonight. Slightly differently from the others, he was born into a Jewish family in Stepney, East London. And at the age of 14, he was apprenticed into the rag trade, where he began cutting fabric and making patterns. He was a reluctant tailor, and in 1955, he traveled to Israel to live on a kibbutz. The following year, he began working at a ceramics factory, which had a studio where the potters could develop their own work, and he knew immediately that this was his vocation. Returning to London a couple of years later, he got a job as a pottery technician, and he continued to develop his own work. He was a pioneer of unconventional vessel-based hand-built forms that celebrate the earthy plasticity of clay. And you can see that from forms, pots on the screen. He had no formal training, and therefore he approached ceramics without inhibition, using any processes or techniques that seemed appropriate. Hand building was his passion, and he passed on his love of experimentation, and unconventional methods to students. Next slide, please, Simon. I couldn't let this short talk on Jewish potters in the mid-20th century go by without mentioning Henry Rothschild. He was, again, he was a German Jewish refugee. He was a staunch supporter of many of these potters. He owned a gallery called Primavera, where he gave many of the potters solo shows and sold their work. And all of the pots on the screen in front of you were bought by the museum through the Primavera gallery. So to close, I hope you've enjoyed this short story of a few of the pioneering Jewish ceramicists who transformed British studio pottery. Their lives and careers were often difficult and disrupted, but the impulse to create new and innovative work persisted. To come to a new country and attain such levels of success and influence shows great strength of character, and we are honoured to have them in our collection today. Right, thank you. I will now be passing over to Saima, who's going to tell you a little bit more about some of the social history objects in our collection.
Thank you so much. That was great. I have some exciting objects here from our social history collection at Bucks County Museum Resource Centre, and they both link to the Rothschild family. So the first one I'm going to be speaking about is the one on the left, the feather fan, and the next one is going to be a cottage model. So the first one here is of an ostrich feather fan. It's cerise in colour. It was gifted to the museum in 1975 by Lady Yvonne de Rothschild, whose husband was Anthony de Rothschild, and he inherited Ascot House in Buckinghamshire. Yvonne was born in 1899 and died in 1977, so it was donated 2 years before she passed away. Ostrich feather fans were really popular and fashionable in the 1920s. They were usually quite large and extravagant and in really bright colours. Usually women would dye them in these really bright colours that you see in front of us here now, usually to match their swinging flapper dresses. And Yvonne would have been a young woman in the 1920s, so we know very clearly she was a very fashionable lady. You can see some wear and tear at the bottom as well, so it's really well used. We've got the next object here also. It's connected to the Rothschild family. This time it's Lady Louise de Rothschild. It's a model cottage, and Lady Louise de Rothschild had this idea of having an exhibition at Holton Industrial Exhibition. So if you think about the 1855 Great Exhibition, but on a much smaller scale, this exhibition was to showcase some of the local talent in Buckinghamshire, and this alongside her daughters Constance and Annie, they decided to have an event where they asked the public to enter a competition. Builders and carpenters entered this competition to create a building, a house for the working class families, and this was submitted by Thomas Durley of Whitchurch. The winner would have the honour of having the house constructed 2 miles from their workshop. So I know you're asking, did this win the prize? Unfortunately not. It came second. It won a silver medal, and therefore it wasn't constructed, but we have the honour of having it in our collection. And on the right hand side you can see an image of the model deconstructed, where there's the ground floor, the first floor, and then the roof on the left. What an honour it is to have in our collection and represent the Rothschild family. This next slide that I've gone to is Discover Bucks, and we've just been speaking about representation, and we are very eager to represent the wider community in Buckinghamshire. This image that you see is a graphic illustration of the Bucks Gallery, which will open next year. It's we are redeveloping one of our permanent galleries on the ground floor, and this image is of our social history part of the gallery, looking at the Bucks people. We're going to have some objects in this gallery that talk about the wider community, and we're very keen to represent the Jewish community and to tell their stories alongside their objects as well. I've currently been working with some community members to do a project called Community Voice Labels. Community members get the chance to write labels for objects within that display that really resonate with them and tell their story and represent the community as we see it now. So thank you ever so much. I'm going to pass it on to Rabbi James again to talk more about Hebrew.
Thank you, Saima. I'm very struck. Well, I'm going to light the Hanukkah so that you get a sense of how Hebrew sounds, and then I'll explain a bit about the Hebrew that you can see at the bottom of the slide. I was very struck, though, as Mel, you were talking about the nature of clay. And in Judaism, we have a prayer that we recite at the Jewish New Year and a Day of Atonement that says, Ki hinei kachomer, we are like the clay and you are the potter. That's describing our relationship to God. And of course, this notion of forming something in clay becomes significant. In the 16th century. We have the Maharal of Prague, who is legendarily supposed to have made a human being, or a being, not human being, a golem out of clay, an object that had life in it, but wasn't a human being that was able to perform functions for the Maharal. And of course, the Maharal of Prague is my great ancestor from the 16th century. And his descendants were also German Jewish refugees. My grandparents were in the same period in the 1930s, arrived in this country. And I was thinking very much about what it means to have an aesthetic of a lump of clay that you then turn into something wonderful that you know will never be, because we don't make graven images of people, you know, we don't make literally people, but what it means to form something of beauty and of something that draws your attention and your eye to it. There's something very bound up in the Jewish story as well. So I'm going to share with you the lighting of the Hanukkah now. We light the shamash, the middle candle. It's not always in the middle. It just has to be off to the side or in front or above. That's clear it's not the same as the others. And we recite two blessings. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kedishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu lahadlik ner shel Chanukah, which means we praise you, God, who has given us the commandments and commanded us to light the candles, the lights of Hanukkah. And Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, she'asa nisim la'avotenu b'yamim hahem u'bazman hazeh. We praise you, God, who has wrought these miracles for us, for our ancestors in those days and at these times. And then we light the candles one after the other, starting on one side and finishing here. And then eventually they will all be lit in 2 nights' time. And the custom is that we don't do anything with the candles except look on them to publicize the miracle. Now, Hanukkah, you're wondering how to say Hanukkah or how to spell Hanukkah. In Hebrew, you can see at the bottom, the word that's just sat on its own derives from pictographic languages, Semitic languages, and the letters then are transformed out of the pictographs into sounds themselves. And the first letter on the right-hand side moving left is a chet. And a chet probably comes maybe from a picture of a courtyard, a chatzer. And so you can imagine it looks like a courtyard. It's a guttural sound from deep in your throat, ch. And so if you're wondering how to pronounce Hanukkah, it's a Hebrew word, not an English word. So you have to be really work hard with your throat. And when you write it, you'll see it written either with a CH or an H with a dot underneath it, or just an H. Any of those ways are appropriate unless you can write Hebrew, in which case you can write it as is written below. The N sound probably is from nachash, meaning snake. It looks a bit like a snake. And the ka sound is from the word in Hebrew kaf, which means hand. You can imagine it looks a bit like a hand like this. So you can greet Jews anyway at this time of year. We have two more nights, tomorrow night and the following night, we will be celebrating Happy Hanukkah or Hanukkah Sameach. All are appropriate. And so I'm concluding this with greetings of a Happy Hanukkah to everybody. And I think we're going to move to questions. Is that right, Sue?
Indeed. I think next time, Rabbi James, we're going to ask you to talk for hours, because I could listen to you for hours. That was really amazing. And I know that lots of people have written to me tonight saying that they're very keen to hear you speak, and I can understand completely why now. So thank you very much for that. And Mel and Simon as well. What a fantastic set of objects and stories that you've managed to unearth for us, and that we didn't realise that we really had in our collections. And what a wonderful opportunity, as Mel has said, for us to be sharing all of that and really making a lot more of that. And we would, as Simon said, like to have a lot more of those objects and represent all of your lives and your voices today. So let's see, I think we've got at least one question there. I don't know if Neil, you can see that. It is addressed to you.
I can, and I know the questioners as well. I'm
Sure.
guessing it's Roger, not Barbie, because it sounds like Roger writing. And just to say, if you see the Q&A at the bottom, you can ask any question. We'll try and answer. So Roger asks, or Barbie asks, good evening, Neil. The history of the early Israelites is full of battles won against overwhelming odds. List some of them. But I've never heard any of them referred to as miracles. I've grown up believing the miracle of the oil is really the only miracle in Jewish history. So, well, first of all, you mean the only miracle with regards to Hanukkah that we mentioned, because obviously other miracles occur all the way through the Bible. The interesting thing is the book of Maccabees is not in the Bible, and the Maccabees, the Hasmoneans, and then later on the Second Temple Jews do see the miracle of the military victory as a miracle. And in fact, a lot of the prayers that we recite at this time seem to be a bit conflicted as to what miracle they are commemorating. It's when we get to the rabbinic period, the rabbis of the Talmud, if you remember that picture of the Talmud, that we see that the story is changed and has evolved, and we get the miracle of the oil. And quite possibly that's because having a story that described how you rebelled against the empire that lorded over you and were successful and victorious using military means, either was seen as a dangerous story to tell and you wanted to suppress the story slightly, or in fact that you now understood that there was going to be no immediate return to Israel and rebuilding of a third temple. And so actually you had to give a different story of hope to the community that wasn't about military prowess and physical might, but was about God's connection to the community. And so the story of the oil then becomes a very powerful symbol of light and of hope, even whilst you're in exile in Babylon. And so they were both described as miracles, but we have suppressed one of them in favor of the other. And it's only actually with the foundation of the State of Israel in 1948 that we start to see a different understanding of what power means, and a different way of trying to understand what it means to be Jewish and to be engaged in a world where you are again sovereign. And actually the miracle of Hanukkah also speaks a lot to the founders of the State of Israel and early Zionists who were trying to free Jews from oppression in Europe, and the Emancipation Enlightenment wasn't seen as enough. And so the complex stories interplay there. I think that's probably enough for now without going on for too long.
There appears to be another comment there, which probably only you can read.
It says shalom, which means hello or well, peace or goodbye, and Hanukkah Sameach we have written here. Hanukkah Sameach, happy Hanukkah. Something if it's a simcha, it's something joyous or happy. I don't know if there are any other questions. I want to ask Mel a question because I really want to ask about what the aesthetics of creating a pot really reflects, because I'm very struck by some of the modernist music and the discords of the music and sort of the breakdown of old pre-war of how there was a lot of sense of breakdown of things that were unified and whole, and music reflects that. And yet when you get to pottery post-war, it felt like a bit of a struggle. I thought Ruth's the pottery of Ruth felt very much like I was drawn to a sense of the struggle of the aesthetic and something pleasing against something that seemed slightly broken. And I wondered if you could comment on that.
Yeah, well, I suppose every potter approaches the clay differently, and some of them it does seem to be a real battle to get out and to use it as a vehicle for expression of emotion, and certainly, I mean, the potters I showed you tonight, they are all very different. And Ruth Duckworth, I mean, we are fortunate to have the largest public collection of her work in a British museum. We've got about 26 examples of her work. And it really does range from little mask-like figures to large sort of slab-built pots that are quite totemic, to really delicate pinched porcelain pieces, and huge coiled pots. So she was certainly using the clay in a very sculptural way and in a very expressive and emotive way. But yes, all of our potters, and whether it's particularly the Jewish potters, or I think you see it in all types of pottery, a lot of them do use the clay as a means of expression. So.
Lovely. I think you have quite a few more questions there to answer, Neil.
Okay, I shall answer. Thank you, Mel. I really appreciate that. Believe it or not, I have an A-level in pottery, and I used to stamp my pots as Neil the Potter, but there was never a career in it for me.
Do come and see our collection at some point.
I'm definitely going to. Maybe we'll bring a synagogue community group to come and see them.
Yeah.
Now, I've been asked about the dates of Hanukkah, and the 25th of Kislev, which is the date that begins Hanukkah, is in the Hebrew calendar the same date, but changes every year in the Gregorian calendar. And the reason for that is because the Hebrew calendar is really a lunisolar calendar. So we follow the months. Month is really derived from the moon. We follow the months according to the cycle of the moon. A new moon every time marks the new month. But of course, our festivals, and Simon might be able to comment about different religious traditions, but Jewish festivals on the whole are tied to seasons. So Passover is a spring festival, Sukkot is an autumn festival, the Tabernacles, and Hanukkah is a winter festival, although it's not about the winter per se. And of course, if you only follow a lunar calendar, you gradually lose, I think it's about 14 days a year back in time. And so eventually your spring festivals slip back, become winter festivals, and autumn festivals slip back and become summer, and so on until you get round again. I think there are 356 days or something like that in a lunar year. And so to compensate for that, 7 times in 19 years, an extra month is inserted into the calendar, in the Hebrew calendar, to push back the dates. But of course, all of that means that we're constantly intercalating the dates. And that means that 25th of Kislev can sometimes fall a bit earlier in the year, and sometimes it can fall slap bang in the middle of Christmas, and sometimes a little bit later. And that's why it moves around.
Great question, Sue. Thank you very much. Sue's just started working with us as a museum to help us bring funding in. And I have to say thank you to the Rothschild Foundation, who have helped to buy the webinar functions that we're using tonight. So thank you for that. We've got another question there, if you'd like to answer that one.
So Alma asks, any examples from either Hanukkah stories or Jewish thought in general of having faith in miracles, improvement and change? Well, actually, the Hanukkah stories the Hanukkah stories that grow up are complicated, and they deal with a lot with sacrifice, not of animal sacrifice, but of human sacrifice. What it means, not of humans, but what it means to commit to a cause and commit in a way that means you're going to fight for what you believe in. It's quite complicated stories, but Judaism as a whole believes in the power to change, because every year we come round, we have the Day of Atonement. It's a chance to reflect on who you are, and a very profound sense of God being forgiven for with that which we've done, and being allowed to repent and atone and change. So Judaism is full of the opportunity to change, and many of the stories that both in the Bible and elsewhere tell stories of people who make mistakes, and then are able to come back from those mistakes and change and be different.
Fantastic. And has anybody got any other questions? Because otherwise I think it's our turn. If we haven't got any more burning questions to ask any of us.
Simon,
So,
I just need to know, did you wave the fan before? Because I know you're not allowed in the museum at the moment.
I know, and I really wanted to actually get the dimensions of it, because it's huge. Many of these kind of fans are really, really big. Usually, sometimes they can be 1.2 meters when they're open. So it was so unfortunate because of COVID and lockdown, I can't go to the stores and actually get a proper dimension. Otherwise, I would have mentioned how big it is.
and I think that leads nicely into just a sort of shout out for our friends at Waddesdon Manor, who we asked to join tonight, but they have their own event, so sadly couldn't be with us. But I know that Waddesdon Manor are very, very keen, particularly with the history of the Rothschilds, to be seen as part of Jewish heritage, and really want people in the Jewish community to recognise that. So they would absolutely love to do something with us if we do this again. But we've got some questions for you now, because this is the first time that we have done certainly a session like this, and certainly the first time we've done something on Hanukkah. So I've got a couple of questions which we are going to hopefully appear on your screen shortly. So we'd like to know, would you join us if we did something like this again? Wow, gosh. So I can see lots of people voting there, and then I can actually show you what you said. So hopefully you can see there's nobody that really thought this wasn't worth coming to, that everybody absolutely loved it. So that's brilliant. Thank you very much. Right, let's see if we can ask a couple of other questions. So it would really help us to know how you heard about today. So if you could tell us, was it through Neil and the South Bucks Jewish Group, or was it through our social media, or us through an e-news? Okay, very interesting. I think, yeah, no, more people voting, just waiting for the last votes to come in. It's changing. People are changing their minds. Okay, I think it's stabilized. So let's show you what you all said. It is all anonymous, so nobody knows who you are and what you've said. Okay, that's really interesting. Okay, that's great. So pretty much everything that we've done has helped to bring people in, but the e-news seems to have been the most helpful. So there we go, Neil, that answers your question. And let's see, have we got one more question we want? So what we'd like to know is, what have you thought about today? What did you like about it? What sort of content are you going to want to see in the future? So let's see what sorts of areas. You can do multiple choice. So we'll see what it is that you liked. Okay. Sure of that. Yeah, people still thinking about it because of the multiple choice. I think it's taking people a bit longer. Oh, no, it's still changing. I think it's settled down now. Okay, so let me show you what you all said. Okay, so I think pretty much it's pretty even there, isn't it? That we seem to have gotten it about right. It was fantastic contributions from Neil there, and wonderful to share some of your heritage with you that we have in our collections that really doesn't get seen often enough. So that is really helpful. Thank you very much indeed to everybody. I'm just going to check to see if there's any more questions. I think maybe one has come in. we got? Yeah, okay. Oh, yes, you okay. Somebody's commenting on where else they heard about it. And that's brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Katie. That's great. If you've got any further comments afterwards, my email address, if you haven't already found it, is in fact up on the website at the moment, just in case any of you are having trouble participating. But I have to thank, I just can't thank you enough, really, Neil, for responding so positively and being so amazing tonight and giving such a fantastic presentation about Hanukkah. I have learnt so much, and I have a brother who speaks Hebrew and attends shul. So this has been brilliant. Thank you. And huge thanks to Mel and Simon, who also have done a lot of work to help share these amazing stories with us. And we very much hope that we will hear from you all in the future, and that Neil and I will continue talking with the museum team about what we can do to collaborate together. So do tell Neil what sort of things you would like to do with the museum, and what you feel the purpose of the museum should be, particularly now and going forward, because we are thinking about what our museum's here for and how do we put the community at the heart of what we do. Any last comments, Rabbi James?
Well, only to say thank you so much for involving us. It really is important, I think, at this time, where we're all in our little boxes looking on Zoom and not able to have the physical contact, that actually we're able to break down barriers and break down the silos of community groups and museums and social projects that allow us to express who we are, our shared heritage, and also the different heritage. So thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you to Simon, who I mean, we must have shared, I don't know how many emails trying to get the presentation right, and to Mel for just such a just wonderful, enlightening presentation of those ceramicists. It was just been a wonderful opportunity for South Bucks Jewish community and to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. Happy Hanukkah. Good night.
Good night.